March 27, 1999, 8:47 in the evening, local time. About 25 miles west of Belgrade, in the black sky above the fields of Vojvodina province, a pilot named Lieutenant Colonel Daryl Patrick Zelko was flying home. He had already done his job. His 2,000-pound laser-guided bomb had found its target in the darkness below. His weapons bay was empty. He was pointed north toward Italy. Nobody on the ground could see him. Nobody on any radar screen could track him. He had flown 39 combat missions over Iraq in 1991 and come home without a scratch every time. Tonight was supposed to be the same. Then something exploded close enough to shake the airframe like a tin can. Zelko looked out and saw fire where his left wing used to be clean. His aircraft, the most secret combat jet in American history, the machine that had rewritten the rules of air warfare, was going down over enemy territory. He grabbed the ejection handle and pulled. In a field outside the village of Budanovci, the wreckage of America's invisible airplane lit up the Serbian countryside like a bonfire. Villagers poured out of their homes and danced on the wings of the downed aircraft. Television cameras arrived within the hour. To understand how a missile system designed in 1959 shot down the most advanced stealth aircraft ever built, you have to go back almost 4 decades. You have to go back to a desk in Moscow. You have to go back to a paper that almost nobody read, written by a man that almost nobody knew, about a problem that almost nobody thought was worth solving. His name was Pyotr Yakovlevich Ufimtsev. He worked at the Moscow Institute for Radio Engineering, and in 1962 he finished a manuscript that the Soviet defense establishment would glance at, dismiss as irrelevant, and shelve without a second thought. The paper was called Method of Edge Waves in the Physical Theory of Diffraction. It was dense, it was mathematical, it was punishing to read. But buried inside its equations was a discovery so significant that when the right person finally understood it, it would make the Soviet Union's own air defense network obsolete. Ufimtsev had figured out that the radar reflection from an object does not depend primarily on how big that object is. It depends on its shape, specifically on how its edges and surfaces are angled relative to the radar beam. A correctly shaped object, even a very large one, could scatter radar energy away from the receiver in every direction except back toward the antenna that sent it. To the radar operator, the object would appear no larger than a steel ball bearing. Moscow filed the paper. Moscow moved on. 8,000 miles away, the United States Air Force was bleeding. By the time American involvement in Vietnam ended in 1973, the Air Force had flown over 5 million sorties in Southeast Asia and lost more than 2,250 fixed-wing aircraft. The Republic F-117 Thunderchief, the workhorse of the bombing campaign over North Vietnam, suffered 334 combat losses out of 833 ever built. 40% of the entire fleet gone. The great majority of those aircraft had not been shot down by enemy pilots in dogfights. They had been knocked out of the sky by radar-guided surface-to-air missiles, Soviet missiles, SA-2 guideline batteries that tracked incoming jets and sent warheads into the flight path at supersonic speed. Then came October 1973. 18 days. That was how long it took Soviet-supplied air defense networks to tear more than 100 Israeli jets out of the sky during the Yom Kippur War. Egypt and Syria had deployed a layered system of SA-2, SA-3, and the new, terrifying SA-6 gainful mobile missile batteries. The Israeli Air Force, considered the most capable in the world, lost 34 A-4 Skyhawks in the first 4 days alone. American strategists watched and felt cold dread settle into their planning documents. The Warsaw Pact had thousands of those batteries arrayed along the inner German border. If NATO ever had to fight its way east, the loss rates would be catastrophic. The question that nobody had been able to answer since the first Soviet surface-to-air missile, fired in anger, was simple and brutal. How do you fly a combat aircraft through a radar-guided missile network and survive? In 1974, a Pentagon official named Charles Myers, Director of Air Warfare Programs in the Office of the Director of Defense Research and Engineering, walked into a conference room at the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in Arlington and pitched an idea. He called it Harvey, after the invisible 6-foot rabbit in the 1950 Jimmy Stewart film. An airplane the radar could not see, the program that followed would be called the Experimental Survivable Testbed. 5 aerospace companies were invited to study the concept: Northrop, McDonnell Douglas, General Dynamics, Fairchild, and Grumman. Lockheed was not one of them. The Skunk Works, Lockheed's legendary Advanced Development Projects division in Burbank, California, had not built a fighter aircraft in over a decade. The agency had simply forgotten to call them. The Skunk Works found out anyway through contacts at the Central Intelligence Agency and pushed hard enough to get a seat at the table. But to do that, they first needed the CIA to release them from secrecy obligations that went back to the U-2 and the SR-71. The CIA agreed. Lockheed was in. The clock was now running. In early 1975, a 49-year-old engineer named Ben Rich walked into the Skunk Works director's office for the first time as the man in charge. Clarence Kelly Johnson, who had built the U-2 reconnaissance plane and the SR-71 Blackbird, and who was, in the eyes of anyone who knew aviation, simply the greatest aircraft designer alive, had finally retired. Rich was his chosen successor. Rich had spent his career as a thermodynamics specialist, not an aerodynamicist. He was shorter than Johnson, quieter, and considerably less terrifying to work for. But he was sharp, politically savvy, and willing to bet on ideas that looked insane on paper. The idea that landed on his desk in early 1975 looked very insane on paper. It came from an engineer named Dennis Dale Overholser. Overholser had been born in Glendale, California in 1939 and raised in Oregon. He was a former state wrestling champion with degrees in mathematics and electrical engineering from Oregon State. He had joined Lockheed in 1964 specifically because he understood computers at a time when most of aerospace still ran on slide rules. One of his habits was reading obscure foreign science papers. And sometime in 1974 or 1975, Overholser read the translated text of Ufimtsev's 1962 monograph. He recognized immediately what the Soviet military had not. Ufimtsev's equations were a calculator. Feed in a shape, get out a radar cross-section. For the first time in history, an engineer could predict how visible an aircraft would be to radar before a single piece of metal was cut. The catch was that the computers of that era could only handle flat surfaces. So the airplane would have to be built entirely out of flat panels, angled precisely to deflect radar energy away from any receiver. It would look nothing like any airplane ever built. Overholser wrote a computer program he called Echo 1 to calculate the radar cross-section of any flat-faceted shape before it was built. He took the results to Ben Rich. Rich took them to Kelly Johnson. What happened next is part of Skunk Works legend, recorded in Rich's own memoir. Johnson looked at the preliminary drawing, came back furious, and in no uncertain terms called the design the dumbest thing he had ever seen and said it would never get off the ground. He threw the proposal back at Rich's feet. Among the skeptics inside the Skunk Works, the design quickly earned a nickname. Aerodynamicist Dick Cantrell called it the Hopeless Diamond, a pun on the Hope Diamond jewel and an honest confession about its aerodynamic prospects. Others called it Rich's Folly. The thing looked like a flying engagement ring. Rich pressed on. The team built a 10-foot wooden model of the design and mounted it on a pole at a radar test range in the Mojave Desert. 5 radar antennas turned on simultaneously. The screen showed nothing. The operator called the test director and said the model must have fallen off the pole. It had not. As Rich watched, a crow landed on the model and the screen lit up. The bird was more visible than the airplane. In April 1976, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency awarded Lockheed a contract to build 2 flying technology demonstrators. The program was codenamed Have Blue. Ben Rich walked into Lockheed's chairman's office and asked for $10.4 million of company money up front, fresh on the heels of the L-1011 commercial disaster that had nearly destroyed the corporation. After tense negotiations, he got his check. The 2 Have Blue aircraft were built almost entirely from off-the-shelf parts. 2 General Electric J-85 turbojets from the Navy's T-2C Buckeye trainer, the landing gear of the Northrop F-5 fighter, a fly-by-wire computer adapted from the F-16. Wings swept back at an astonishing 72.5 degrees. Twin vertical tails that leaned inward in an inverted V. Total cost for both prototypes, roughly $35 million. Both aircraft were secretly trucked inside a transport to Groom Lake, Nevada, the classified test facility in the desert most Americans would come to know by another name. Area 51. On December 1, 1977, Lockheed test pilot William Park lifted Have Blue off the dry lakebed for the first time. Kelly Johnson, watching from the ground, slapped Ben Rich on the back and said, "Well, Ben, you got your first airplane." The aircraft was barely flyable. It was aerodynamically unstable in all three axes simultaneously. Without its quadruple redundant fly-by-wire computers correcting thousands of inputs per second, it would tumble out of the sky. But it flew, and the radar tests that followed were astonishing. Have Blue was essentially invisible to almost every threat radar in the American inventory. Then the crashes started. On May 4, 1978, on the 36th flight of Have Blue No. 1, Bill Park brought the aircraft in hard and jammed the right main landing gear in a semi-retracted position. He climbed to 10,000 feet and tried 3 times to shake it free. On the third failure, he was ordered to eject. The ejection inflicted serious back injuries that permanently grounded him. He never flew an experimental aircraft again. Have Blue No. 2 flew on July 20, 1978, with Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Ken Dyson at the controls. Over the following year, Dyson flew it more than 50 times against every radar the United States possessed, proving beyond any doubt that stealth was not a theory. It was a weapon. On July 11, 1979, on the 52nd flight, an exhaust clamp loosened and burned through hydraulic lines. The fly-by-wire system went into violent oscillations. Dyson endured 7 negative G shudders before he could reach the ejection handle. He ejected at 20,000 feet and survived. Both demonstrators destroyed. Program declared a triumph. On November 1, 1978, the Pentagon had formally decided to build a full-scale operational stealth attack aircraft. The codename was Senior Trend. The program covered 5 developmental aircraft and an initial production batch. The funding commitment was $340 million. The contract was committed before anyone had proved the concept could survive years of real-world flying. The man who led the design was Dr. Alan Brown, an English-born aerodynamicist who had earned an engineering apprenticeship at Blackburn Aircraft in England and joined Lockheed in 1960. Brown directed the design of the F-117 from 1978 to 1982 and became Lockheed's Director of Low Observable Technology. He would receive the Daniel Guggenheim Medal in 2021, one of the highest honors in American aerospace engineering. What Brown and his team produced was unlike anything that had ever flown. 65 feet long, a 43-foot wingspan, 52,500 pounds at takeoff, 2 non-afterburning General Electric F404 engines with platypus-shaped exhaust nozzles that mixed hot gas with cool air to reduce the aircraft's heat signature. Top speed just under the speed of sound. Service ceiling 45,000 feet. Its radar cross-section, by most declassified estimates, was roughly 0.001 square meters, the size of a small bird. Ben Rich liked to say it was the size of an eagle's eyeball. The airframe was covered in hundreds of flat, angled facets, each tilted to deflect radar energy away from any receiver. Even the cockpit canopy was coated with a fine metallic mesh, because without it, the pilot's helmet alone would have registered larger on radar than the entire airplane. It carried no radar of its own, no air-to-air missiles, no way to fight back if a fighter ever found it. Its only weapons were 2 2,000-pound GBU-27 Paveway laser-guided bombs carried in 2 internal weapons bays. It was not a fighter in any real sense. General Robert J. Dixon at Tactical Air Command had pushed for the F designation specifically because the best pilots were more easily attracted to an aircraft marked as a fighter rather than an attack plane. Its real job was to fly alone at night, deep into defended airspace, and put a bomb through a window. Pilots who flew it called it the Wobblin' Goblin. The first aircraft, Air Force serial number 79-10780, was secretly trucked from Burbank inside a transport and assembled at Groom Lake in the spring of 1981. Fuel leaks in the early airframe had delayed the maiden flight by nearly 11 months past the original target. The man chosen to fly it first was Harold C. Farley, Jr., known as Hal. He had been a naval aviator since 1959, had flown A-4 Skyhawks from carrier decks, had spent 8 years as a test pilot for Grumman, logging nearly 1,000 hours in the F-14 Tomcat, and had been hired by Lockheed in 1979 specifically for this program. On the morning of June 18, 1981, at 6:05 Pacific Time, Hal Farley pushed the throttles forward on the dry lake bed at Groom Lake, Nevada. The strange, faceted, pastel-camouflaged machine rolled and then lifted from the desert floor into the early morning light. It was also Ben Rich's 56th birthday. The program's chief political protector was Dr. William Perry, the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering under President Jimmy Carter from 1977 to 1981. Perry, a mathematician and former electronics entrepreneur, had championed stealth, precision-guided munitions, and battlefield intelligence as the core of what he called the offset strategy: substitute American technology for Soviet numerical superiority. Without Perry's political cover inside the Pentagon, the program would almost certainly have been cancelled during the budget fights of the late 1970s. By the time Hal Farley lifted off that morning, the aircraft already had a name on paper. It would be called the F-117A Nighthawk. But for the next 7 years, that name would not exist in public. The aircraft would not exist in public. The pilots flying it would not exist in public. The Air Force had to find a way to operate dozens of combat aircraft from a remote desert base, recruit the best fighter pilots in the service to fly them, and make sure that no one, not wives, not children, not neighbors, not the Soviet Union, ever found out. What followed was one of the most extraordinary feats of institutional secrecy in American military history. On October 15, 1979, the Air Force quietly activated the 4,450th Tactical Group at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. Its official commander was Colonel Robert Jackson. Its official mission, visible to outsiders, was testing of the A-7D Corsair II attack aircraft. About 20 A-7D aircraft were deliberately parked outside the hangars at Tonopah Test Range Airport, 150 miles northwest of Las Vegas, marked with Las Vegas tailcodes so that Soviet reconnaissance satellites passing overhead would conclude this was a quiet, unremarkable test unit. Tonopah was remote enough to vanish from casual observation and close enough to the Nellis Range Complex that simulated combat exercises could be flown without leaving restricted airspace. The runways were long, the hangars were large. The surrounding desert was empty for 100 miles in every direction. The pilots who flew there lived a double life so complete it would be difficult to describe to anyone who had not experienced it. Selection was ferocious. The minimum standard was 1,000 hours of fighter time, typically at the rank of captain or major, with an instructor pilot background, and a service record that stood out from other records that already stood out. Recruiters appeared without warning at Air Force bases across the country. They carried no paperwork, wore no insignia, arrived and departed in unmarked aircraft, and told prospective candidates almost nothing. Major Al Whitley, who would become the first fully trained operational F-117 pilot, was brought into a room at Nellis where the commanding officer cracked the door, checked his identification, closed the door again, and after a pause opened it and said only, "Well, it looks good. I guess you can come in." Whitley was told he could not discuss what the assignment involved with his wife. He had to decide yes or no before he left the building. Whitley said yes before the sentence was finished. Every Monday morning, pilots and maintainers, roughly 2,500 people at the program's peak, boarded contracted Key Airlines Boeing 727 jets for the short flight from Las Vegas to Tonopah. They flew in, worked all week, slept in dormitories on a compound called Man Camp, and flew home Friday afternoon. No family members were ever permitted at Tonopah. All flights were scheduled for the hours of darkness to avoid Soviet satellite passes. Hangar doors closed 1 hour before sunrise. Missions were cancelled if moonlight was bright enough to illuminate the airframe from the ground. Pilots took lie detector tests every 3 months. The questions were simple and blunt. Had they discussed classified information with anyone outside the program? Had their wives asked what they were working on? Had they told anyone anything? Spouses adapted as best they could to a silence that never ended. Ann Whitley, Al Whitley's wife, would not learn what her husband had been doing for 5 years until the day the Pentagon finally announced the aircraft's existence. Ben Rich later wrote in his memoir that a Soviet intelligence analyst in Moscow probably knew more about his Skunk Works programs than his own wife and children. He was not certain he was exaggerating. The pilots gave the aircraft a second nickname, Because they could only fly at night because they lived in the dark and slept during the day, they called themselves vampires. Then the darkness started killing them. On the night of July 11th, 1986, Major Ross Mulhare, 35 years old, took off from Tonopah at 1:13 in the morning in F-117, number 81-10792, call sign Ariel 31. He had mentioned to a fellow pilot earlier that evening that he was exhausted and could not shake it. At approximately 1:50 in the morning, he banked southeast and dove. His aircraft hit a hillside 14 miles northeast of Bakersfield, California, just inside the boundary of Sequoia National Forest, and the resulting fire took 16 hours to extinguish. Mulhare had logged only 53.5 hours in the aircraft. The Air Force response was swift and strange. The crash site was declared a national defense area. Armed guards turned away firefighters and reporters. Local first responders were required to sign secrecy statements before they could approach the perimeter. The Air Force press officer told reporters only that the service had no comment on what type of aircraft it was, where it came from, or what it had been doing. 14 months later, on the night of October 14th, 1987, Major Michael Stewart took off from Tonopah on a routine training sortie, call sign Burner 54, and flew his F-117 directly into the Nevada desert floor, 60 miles east of Alamo. There was no moon. He never attempted to eject. He had 76.5 hours in type. Spatial disorientation was the probable cause. Both men had been highly experienced fighter pilots with exceptional records. Both had fewer than 100 hours in the F-117. The radical aerodynamic instability of the aircraft, the relentless cognitive demand of flying on instruments alone in total darkness, and the accumulated fatigue of years of night operations had combined to extract a cost that no amount of secrecy could conceal from the families involved. 2 pilots dead, no public explanation, no official acknowledgement that the aircraft they were flying even existed. By 1988, the wall of secrecy was cracking from all sides. The Washington Post had published accounts from unnamed sources placing roughly 50 stealth aircraft at Tonopah. The Sacramento Bee had described the base's physical layout. The Testor Plastic Model Company had released a kit of a speculative stealth fighter they called the F-19, which was entirely wrong in its design but close enough in concept to appear on hobby shop shelves across America. About 700,000 of them sold almost immediately, making it the best-selling model airplane ever produced up to that time. The Air Force made the calculation that continued total secrecy was no longer serving the program's interests. With a presidential election 6 weeks away, Congress pushed back against a public announcement that close to Election Day. So the announcement waited. On November 10th, 1988, 2 days after Vice President George H.W. Bush was elected, the announcement was made 88, 2 days after Vice President George Bush defeated Michael Dukakis. A Pentagon spokesman named J. Daniel Howard stepped to a podium and showed the American press a single fuzzy black and white photograph. The aircraft in the picture was unlike anything the public had seen. Angular, faceted, black, alien in outline. The F-117A existed. In April of 1990, the Air Force put an F-117 on public static display at Nellis Air Force Base for the first time. Approximately 150,000 people came. Among them, for the first time, were the wives and children of the pilots and maintainers who had been disappearing every Monday to Tonopah for nearly a decade, working on something they could not describe, flying something they could not name, and coming home Friday afternoons with the same non-committal answer to the same patient questions. If you want to know what happened when those black jets flew over Baghdad, please like this video right now. Every like sends this story to someone who has never heard of the F-117. Please subscribe. At 2:51 in the morning on January 17, 1991, 150 miles inside Iraqi airspace, Major Greg Feast, Bandit 261, placed the crosshairs of his infrared targeting system on a hardened Iraqi Air Defense Operations Center buried beneath concrete and sand. He released a 2,000-pound GBU-27 laser-guided bomb. It flew through the darkness on a beam of invisible light and hit within feet of its aim point. It was the first bomb of the Gulf War. Behind Feast, 11 more F-117 pilots were already pressing toward Baghdad. At exactly 3 in the morning, Another stealth pilot put his crosshairs on the Iraqi Air Force Communications Building in downtown Baghdad, found an air shaft in the center of the roof, and sent his bomb through it. The four walls blew outward. Baghdad erupted. Anti-aircraft guns opened up across the city, throwing tracers into the sky in every direction. Television cameras on the roof of the Al Rashid Hotel captured the light show live on the cable news network. From the footage, it looked like the most heavily defended airspace on Earth was fighting off an enormous raid. There was almost no one in the sky, just a handful of black jets that none of those radar-guided guns and missiles could find. The 37th Tactical Fighter Wing operated 36 F-117 aircraft from King Khalid Air Base in southwestern Saudi Arabia, perched at 6,700 feet of field elevation in the mountains near Khamis Mushait, 650 miles south of Baghdad. Pilots flew missions that averaged 5.5 hours each, requiring multiple aerial refueling connections in total darkness each way. In the first 24 hours of the air war, those 36 F-117 aircraft struck roughly a third of all the strategic targets the entire coalition attacked that night. They represented 2.5% of coalition tactical air power. Over the 43 days of the air campaign, the 37th Tactical Fighter Wing flew approximately 1,300 combat sorties, dropped more than 2,000 tons of precision-guided bombs, and struck what the Air Force described as 1,600 high-value targets. Not one FIB and F-117 was shot down. Not one was hit by enemy fire. Not one was successfully tracked by Iraqi radar. A 1997 Government Accountability Office report on the Desert Storm air campaign offered a sobering counterpoint. While the F-117's survivability was total and its ability to reach the most heavily defended Iraqi targets was unmatched by any other aircraft, the actual probability of a planned strike hitting its assigned aim point ranged between 41 and 60%, not the 80% that the Air Force and Lockheed had publicly claimed. The aircraft was real. The mythology around it had grown larger than the reality. The war ended on February 28, 1991. Colonel Al Whitley, who had been the first man to fly the F-117 in operational service, commanded the 37th Tactical Fighter Wing during Desert Storm and led the unit home to Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico on April 1, 1991. Thousands of people lined the runway. The story was not over. Back to Serbia. Lieutenant Colonel Dale Zelko had been one of those Desert Storm pilots. By 1999, he was a veteran of 39 combat missions over Iraq, flying the same aircraft that had never been touched by enemy fire across an entire war. On the night of March 27, 1999, he lifted off from Aviano Air Base in northern Italy as part of Operation Allied Force, the NATO air campaign against Yugoslavia over the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. He flew in, found his target, dropped his bomb, and turned for home. The weapons bay was closed. He was pointed north. He did not know that a Serbian lieutenant colonel named Zoltan Dani had spent the previous months preparing for exactly this moment. Dani commanded the 3rd Battery of the 250th Air Defense Missile Brigade of the Yugoslav Army. His equipment was Soviet, old and by Western standards, thoroughly obsolete. His missile system was the S-125 Neva, known in NATO as the SA-3 Goa, a radar-guided weapon that had entered Soviet service in 1961. Each missile carried a warhead packed with 4,500 metal fragments, detonated by a radio proximity fuse when the missile passed close enough to a target. In a war being fought against aircraft equipped with sensors and computers built in the 1980s and 90s, Dani was operating hardware from the era of the Mercury space program. But Dani had read everything publicly available about how the Americans suppressed air defenses. He understood the pattern. NATO would fly F-16, CJ Wild Weasel aircraft designed to hunt radar-emitting systems with anti-radiation missiles. Accompanying electronic warfare aircraft would jam radar frequencies. The standard American procedure was to saturate defenses with jamming and missile fire, then send in the strike aircraft. Against a radar that stayed on the air and broadcast its position, this was essentially automatic. So Dani moved constantly. He drilled his crews to relocate the battery in 90 minutes instead of the normal 150. He built decoy sites using captured radar equipment to draw anti-radiation missiles away from his real positions. He limited his tracking radar to bursts of no more than 20 seconds to deny the wild weasels a target. He positioned informants near Italian air bases to watch NATO takeoffs and report back to him. By his own account, his battery survived 23 anti-radiation missile attacks during the war without a single loss, and he had noticed something about his old P-18 spoon rest surveillance radar that nobody in NATO seemed to be accounting for. At its lowest operating frequency, its long radar wavelength was large enough relative to the F-117's airframe that the faceted surfaces did not scatter the signal away as efficiently as they did against shorter wavelength radars. The F-117 was not invisible on a P-18. It was faint, imprecise, and difficult to track. But it was there. NATO planners had grown comfortable. The F-117 had operated without losses for 8 years. The routes it flew had fallen into patterns. Night after night, the same corridors, the same timing windows. On the evening of March 27th, Danny's informants reported that no electronic warfare aircraft had taken off from Italian bases. The jamming umbrella would be thinner than usual. Danny made his decision. His P-18 detected an inbound contact. He turned on his tracking radar for 20 seconds. No lock. Off again. Another 20 seconds. Still nothing resolved. Off. Then, on a third activation, at a moment when Zelko's aircraft configuration presented a slightly larger radar return, the tracking system acquired. Sergeant George Anisic at the launch console fired 2 S-125 missiles. The first passed close overhead and its proximity fuse did not register the nearly invisible target. The warhead did not detonate. The second exploded close enough that its 4,500 fragments tore through the aircraft's left wing and fuselage. Zelko felt the airframe shudder. He saw the fire. He grabbed the ejection handle and pulled. He landed in a field about 1 kilometer from the burning wreckage of Something Wicked, tail number 82-0806, a Desert Storm veteran that had flown 39 combat missions without a wound. Zelko hid himself in a drainage ditch and used his survival radio to call for help. Yugoslav soldiers, police, and local villagers fanned out through the surrounding fields. At one point they came within a few hundred meters of his position. He pressed himself into the mud and did not move. 8 hours later, in the early morning of March 28th, one MH-53M pave low, one MH-53J pave low, and one MH-60G Pave Hawk from United States Air Force Special Operations Command came in low over the fields and brought Zelko home. The pararescue men who completed the recovery were Staff Sergeant Eric Giacchino and Senior Airman John Jordan. The wreckage of Something Wicked burned in the field outside Budanovci through the night. CNN cameras arrived. Serbian soldiers photographed themselves with the debris. Within days, Russian and Chinese intelligence officials were reported to be visiting the crash site, and local farmers were reportedly selling pieces of the aircraft's stealth coating. The first operational defeat of the world's most advanced stealth aircraft had been witnessed, photographed, and broadcast globally before the sun came up. Zoltan Dani was promoted to colonel, the highest rank available to him in the Yugoslav army. He retired from military service in 2004 and opened a small bakery in his home village of Skoranovac in northern Serbia. 5 weeks after Zelko was shot down, on May 2, 1999, Dani's battery struck again. The target was an F-16CG flown by Lieutenant Colonel David Goldfein, callsign Hammer 34. Goldfein was hit, ejected over Serbia, and was rescued. He survived to become, years later, the 21st Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. In 2011, Zoltan Dani and Dale Zelko met face-to-face for the first time. They met in Serbia. The two men walked together through the Belgrade Aviation Museum, where the wreckage of Something Wicked, including the canopy, the ejection seat, and a section of wing, is now on permanent public display. Dani served Zelko bread from his bakery. The two men became close friends and have spoken publicly together several times since. The story of the F-117 did not end with a shoot-down. The aircraft flew in Operation Enduring Freedom over Afghanistan beginning in 2001 and in the opening hours of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. On March 19 of that year, Lieutenant Colonel David Toomey and Major Mark Hone each carried 2 EGBU-27 enhanced precision-guided bunker-buster bombs toward a Baghdad compound called Dora Farms, believed to be a hideout of Saddam Hussein. Their strikes were the opening shots of that war, but the Cold War was long over. The aircraft and the threats it had been built to defeat had transformed or collapsed. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, the F-22 Raptor, and the F-35 Lightning II were all either in service or approaching it. Each incorporated the lessons the F-117 had taught. Each was more capable and far less dependent on the absolute darkness and elaborate secrecy the Nighthawk had required to survive. On December 28, 2005, the Pentagon ordered the retirement of their F-117 fleet by October of 2008, freeing roughly $1.07 billion per year to fund additional F-22 Raptors. The F-117 had served its purpose. The first 6 aircraft flew their final missions on March 12, 2007, at a ceremony at Holloman Air Force Base. The formal Sunset Stealth Retirement Ceremony was held at Holloman on April 21, 2008. 4 black jets flew a final formation overhead. The next day, retired Colonel Jack Forsyth led a 4-ship of the last operational F-117 aircraft on a final cross-country mission that stopped at Palmdale, California, where Lockheed engineers, some of whom had designed the aircraft more than 25 years earlier, came out to the flight line and signed their names on the weapons bay doors of each jet. The aircraft were then ferried to Tonopah Test Range Airport, their original home where their wings were removed, and they were placed in climate-controlled storage in the same hangars they had occupied during the years when the world did not know they existed. The last flight of the last F-117 airframe, serial number 86-0831, took place on August 11, 2008. A total of 558 Air Force pilots ever earned a Bandit number during the program's operational life. The first was Major Al Whitley. Bandit 150. The last was General David Goldfein, Bandit 708. Every one of them had been asked to decide in a room with no paperwork and no rank insignia on the recruiter's flight suit whether they wanted to fly something they could never talk about, for a mission they could never describe, for years that would vanish from their public record. Every one of them said yes. The people who made this program possible deserve to be named. Pyotr Ufimtsev, the Soviet physicist whose dismissed 1962 paper contained the mathematical seed of everything that followed, emigrated to the United States in 1990 and joined the faculty at the University of California, Los Angeles. He learned years after the fact that his obscure monograph had become the intellectual foundation of the most consequential aircraft of the Cold War era. He is still alive. Dennis Overholser, the engineer who read that paper and understood what it meant, who built the Echo 1 program that made stealth calculable, and who spent decades shaping the most significant aeronautical secret in American history in conditions of careful obscurity, died on April 28, 2026, at the age of 86. The president of Lockheed Martin Aeronautics issued a statement the following day, saying that Overholser had spent decades shaping history far from public view through work that demanded brilliance, discipline, and a rare depth of character. Ben Rich, who had bet his career and $10 million of company money on a design his own mentor called Hopeless, who managed the program from its first radar test in the Mojave to the night Baghdad burned, retired from the Skunk Works in 1991. He died in 1995. Kelly Johnson, who had been so furious about the Hopeless diamond, eventually changed his mind. He told Rich years later that he had never believed it was possible to separate an aircraft's radar visibility from its physical size. He acknowledged that he had been wrong. Alan Brown, who turned Overholser's equations into an actual flying machine and managed the program through production, received the Daniel Guggenheim Medal in 2021. He died the following year, in 2022. Bill Park, the test pilot who first lifted Half Blue off the desert floor in December of 1977 and suffered a back injury that permanently grounded him 5 months later, never flew an experimental aircraft again. He died of a heart attack in 1996. Ken Dyson, the only pilot to fly both Half Blue prototypes and walk away from both ejections, died on August 15, 2019 at the age of 81. Hal Farley, who lifted the first F-117 off the lake bed at Groom Lake on Ben Rich's birthday, retired from Lockheed, bought a sailboat with his wife, and spent the next 7 years at sea. Major Ross Mulhare and Major Michael Stewart never came home from the Nevada desert. They died flying an aircraft that officially did not exist, in crashes the Air Force could not publicly explain, at a time when their families had no way to grieve in public because the program they had served could not acknowledge their sacrifice. A small American flag has flown, replaced periodically, near the spot in Sequoia National Forest where Mulher's aircraft went into the hillside. Dale Zelko speaks publicly now about that night in 1999 and about his friendship with the man who shot him down. He has said that when he and Danny look at each other, they see not enemies, but two professional soldiers who did their jobs and found in the aftermath something more valuable than victory. Zoltan Danny bakes bread in Skorenovac. The Nighthawk itself stands in several museums. The National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio has one. The Air Force Armament Museum at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida has one. The Smithsonian's Udvar Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia has one. And in the Belgrade Aviation Museum, behind glass in the capital of the country that brought it down, sits the wreckage of Something Wicked. Serbian schoolchildren walk past it on field trips. Veterans who flew the F-117 have come from the United States specifically to stand in front of the remains of the airplane they once thought invisible. That display in Belgrade may be the most honest monument this program ever received. A Soviet physicist wrote equations in 1962 that his own country ignored. An American engineer read those equations a decade later and understood what no one else had. A small group of engineers in Burbank built a program around that understanding in conditions of total secrecy. Pilots flew the result in complete darkness for 7 years, without the world knowing it existed. 2 of those pilots died in that darkness, and their families could say nothing. Then the aircraft went to war and performed feats of precision the world had never seen from the air. And then a missile system conceived in 1959, operated by a patient man who had read the right books and broken his own rules at precisely the right moment, proved that it was not, in the end, invisible. The lesson the F-117 leaves behind is not that stealth does not work. It is that no technological advantage is permanent. The enemy is always thinking. The moment you forget that, he will remind you. Danny was thinking. The Americans had stopped. That is the story. And now you know it. But most people do not. Most people have never heard of Dennis Overholser. They have never heard of Bill Park, or Ross Mulher, or Michael Stewart, or Hal Farley. They do not know that the mathematical foundation of American stealth came from a paper shelved in Moscow in 1962, written by a physicist his own government forgot. That is where you come in. Hit the like button right now, not for this channel, for them. Every like sends this video to someone new, someone who should know what these men built and what it cost to build it. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We go through declassified records, official histories, and primary sources every week to find programs like this one. Programs that shaped the world from inside rooms where no nameplate was allowed on the door. Drop a comment right now. Tell us where you are watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany, Pakistan, India, Japan. We have viewers on every continent, and every comment pushes this story to someone who has never heard it. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us their branch, their era, their name, if you are willing to share it. This comment section is a record. Every name in it matters. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying to the end. And thank you for making sure that the engineers who built this machine, the pilots who flew it in total darkness, and the men who never came home from the Nevada desert finally get the attention they earned.